This picture over here was taken in the year 1991. It was the era of spectacular hair. I was 16 years old, or in my case, it was just the era of hair. And among many other interesting decisions that I made that year was to start work as an amateur lifesaver at what was then called Atlantis Water Park, just outside of Centurion. It was my job to sit at the top of the tallest slide, it was called the Barracuda, and watch other poor 15 and 16-year-old kids walk up the hill, sit there on the platform, look at me with terror in their eyes. You could literally see at that point that they are regretting literally every single decision in life that brought them to that point. And as they started protesting, it was my work to press on the pedal, send them screaming down the slide below into the water as they, still protested all the way down. Now, it was interesting to my 16-year-old mind that there were always two kinds of people on that slide that would ride that slide at the water park. The first type of people would do the exact same thing. They would go screaming down the slide. They would get water up the nose. They would feel like they were drowning. They would look that way as well. But then they would get back up and explain to everybody why they would never do it again. But then there were a second group of people. And it didn't matter whether they were 8 or 80 years old. They would have that exact same experience. They would go down that slide, feel like they were drowning, get water up the nose, come back out the other end, and then slowly start walking up the hill and go stand in the queue for the slide again. They would take the arm of somebody else that maybe rode the slide with them, compare notes, try different tricks and tactics, and they would just ride that slide the whole day. It was so interesting to me. And you know what? In 2022, where we're sitting here at CoLab, we might not be riding water slides anymore. Atlantis Water Park has closed down a long time ago. But sometimes it does feel like we're drowning, right? And I want to propose that we are drowning. We are drowning in information. We are drowning in 163 zettabytes of information, which is the amount of data that is available for you to access today. And if you have no idea how much that is, join the club, because I also don't know. But just to give you an idea, it's more or less the equivalent of watching the entire Netflix catalog, for those of you that are into that, just millions and millions of times. For some of us that are a little bit older, it's about the idea of stacking just a bunch of DVDs, 40 trillion DVDs, to reach all the way to the moon and back, not once, but hundreds of millions of times. That is an insane amount of information. Just to make it even a little bit more practical, just to take our favorite video platform, YouTube. So in their most recent research, YouTube reports that people are watching 500 billion videos every single day. That creators are uploading up to 500 hours of video. It's not every month, not every week, not even every hour, but every single minute. That is every single day, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. That is a mind-numbing amount of information. What is interesting about that specific YouTube report, though, and you can go and look for it online if you want, that YouTube reports that their users acknowledge to search for and find content, 51% of them, for educational purpose. So it seems like this generation, at least, is still super keen on learning new things, and heaven knows they have the ability and the channels right at their fingertips to do it. So, back to my story. Right after I finished at the water park, I did what many other young men of my economic and cultural background did, which was to go off to university and study a degree of more or less generic application and interest. And in my case, I studied a law degree with a commercial major. After that, I did my articles of clerkship at a divorce and insolvency practice just down the road here, which was, of course, super uplifting and inspiring on a daily basis. And then I also did what many aspiring young legal professionals did at that time, which was to, after my admissions exam, promptly quit my job, run off and join a performing arts company, where I worked as a budding actor and musician and a dancer, if you will. So nowadays, since then, I've worked as a PR agent, as a communications director, as a graphic designer, where I find myself splitting my time now mostly between being a brand strategist and a learning designer. Over the past couple of decades, I've had the opportunity to just undergo, like many of you probably, a battery of personality tests and assessments. And the conclusion, as far as I'm concerned, is pretty clear. I'm an obsessive and compulsive hoarder of information. I'm a complete data junkie. I love to have information for no other reason as just to have it. I don't want to use it for something specific. I just want to hoard it and have it for myself. So what I have done is just to satisfy this very unhealthy need. A couple of years ago, 2 years exactly, I built a little platform where I can just store some of this information so that I can have a place where I can look back at it admire it, roll around in it. And for the past 2 years, I've collected up to 2,000 pieces of information. Those are articles and videos and research reports, which amounts to pretty much 3 to 4 pieces of rather bulky and hefty information a day, things that I'm consume. So just to give you an idea of how that plays out in my world, last week Tuesday, I think it was the 15th, my screen time app on my iPhone reported data usage of 5 hours and I think, 18 minutes. And for the whole of that week, that amounted to 21 hours. That is insane. It's a whole day of my week that I spent interacting with information, consuming content, working with data. That's a whole second job that I'm working in my spare time. So it doesn't matter whether it had to do with my career and wherever my career went and or how I'm navigating information in the world. Here are 2 things I've learned that are true for me, and maybe you can resonate with that. The first thing is, no matter how much information I have or collect or interact with or content I consume, it will never make me a better husband, a better father, a better colleague, friend, or even better at my job. And the second thing is, literally every piece of success, if any, I've ever had in life came from learning while doing while interacting and failing and experimenting and just trying again. And you know what? This type of squiggly career building is not just unique to me. So whether it's Angela Duckworth referencing grit as a way to passion and perseverance, or Malcolm Gladwell talking about his by now legendary 10,000 hours of deliberate practice as a way to attain true mastery, or even Helen Tupper referencing the actual phrase squiggly career as a way for meaningful career making in the world, they all seem to be part of this rising tide, this collective conscience that understands that learning, true learning, lies beyond the boundary of books, beyond our capacity to access information and being assessed in our ability to retain it. So I want to propose a new understanding of learning just for myself, not just in terms of what learning is, but especially in terms of when it happens. I want to start living in a world where learning is not just about knowing more, where learning is actually about developing the ability to do better in the world, to make a difference in the world. And in terms of when learning happens, that learning is not a singular occurrence that occurs only between the ages of 18 and 21 and never again. That learning is not linear. It doesn't have a specific beginning and end and just works in a straight line. But I want to start living in a world where learning is a continuous, lifelong journey, something that keeps you busy for your entire existence and throughout your career. So obviously the question arises, is it possible for us, whether on an institutional level or on an individual level, to design a framework to take this understanding of learning and implement it practically for our lives? And since we're already drinking from the fire hose of the internet, let's start there. Let's see if we can take data and automatically convert it into skills. And what would be the dots in between, and can we connect those dots? My proposition would be the first thing we do is to take data and see if we can turn that into information. And you only do that by sifting for relevance. Let me show you how. Do you remember that little resonance library that I built with the 2,000 and something resources in? What I've done the past couple of months is I started creating buckets of relevance, themes, if you will. So for me, I'm interested in things like experience design and culture and learning and all kinds of design and all kinds of other things. And I started tagging some of these resources, creating buckets that I can refer to back later so that at any given time, depending on what I'm working on or what I'm interested in or what I'm being prompted on, I can go back to these buckets and have that information which are now relevant to me right at my fingertips. And that's how you turn meaningless data into information that's relevant to you only. The next thing you need to do is to take that information and turn that into knowledge. And the only way to do that really is to make it your own, to see if it's possible for you to, whether through memorization or study or whatever your process is, take that and take it from its original source out of the device or notebook or book or whatever it is that you use and just deposit it into your heart and into your mind so that you can become personally knowledgeable on a subject as you live and work out in the world. This is where the traditional learning process leaves us. But as you can see, there's still a way to go, all the way towards actually having the ability to develop a skill to do better in the world. The next step is to see, is it possible to take knowledge and distill that into wisdom? And there literally is only one thing that can do that. And this is this tricky idea of experience. I love the fact that a tomato, when you just stop at knowledge, you can understand that a tomato is technically a fruit, but you need to go through the motions of putting that in a fruit salad, tasting the conflict in textures, concentrating really hard to just withhold your gag reflex while making a mental note to never ever do that again, to teach you that it's a super bad idea, that although being technically a fruit, that a tomato does not belong in a fruit salad. Knowledge will never teach you that. Only a wisdom through experience does that. And then the last thing is, how do we take our wisdom and then make that into a skill? I love the story about on Fifth Avenue when a tourist walked by the New York local and asked him, "Excuse me, sir, is it possible, can you explain to me how do I get to Carnegie Hall?" His experience, his deadpan response was, "Well, it's super easy. You have to practice. You have to practice. You have to practice. That's how you get to Carnegie Hall." You know what? I'm a hobbyist photographer on Instagram, and it takes me probably anything between 500 and 1,000 shots to get a frameable picture. The difference between myself and the professional photographer is every single time she hits that shutter button, it comes out perfect. When it comes to practice, we don't need to practice until we finally get it right. We need to practice until it's impossible for us to get it wrong. And only then do you have a freshly minted, durable skill. And that, friends, is how you go from data all the way to making a difference in the world. Traditionally, for us, we've learned that learning is linear. It has a very specific beginning, it's a very specific end. But when we look at learning in this fashion and we see the complexity of it, we understand all the different textures and layers, we understand that learning is actually a circle. Not a circle which you navigate around and around and around, chasing your own tail, but it actually works like a spiral. And the more times you go around, you actually travel upwards and you become masterful at that specific skill. And when you look at it like that, you'll see there's a gap between having that skill and just going around the circle again, because being a master at something inevitably means that when you work out in the world, when you practice that skill, you are going to be generating more data, more opportunity to learn, more things to glean new insights from. The only way to really do that is by being curious about the effect that you have in the world. We are being curious, we develop a posture for curiosity when we are humble, when we can become beginners again, and when we can adopt a growth mindset. So if you're only interested in knowing more about the problems in the world, then going through this whole idea of reframing your definition for learning is probably not for you. But if, like me, you are actually interested in not just knowing more about the problems in the world, but actually doing something about it, I want to propose to you a new definition for learning, where learning isn't inaccessible. It's accessible no matter where you live or how much you earn. It's deeply personal, which means that you take deep personal responsibility for your own learning journey, and where learning is all about doing better, not just about knowing more. I want to invite you into this journey. Join this lifelong learning revolution with me by making 3 choices. The one is to choose change, to think differently about what you traditionally were taught or even think learning is. The second one is to choose courage, the courage to fail, the courage to look bad, the courage to experiment and just try again. And then the third choice is to choose this idea of curiosity, to choose to be curious about your job, about your life, and about what's going on in the world. Because before you know it, what's going on in the world becomes your life, and then your life might become your job. You know, schools, those things that we all went to, they're super great at teaching us what to learn, but not so good at showing us how to learn it. My friend is always fond of saying, we don't need more gatekeepers to give us access to yet more information. What we are desperate for is mentors to help us assess and apply the information we already have. I don't know if you remember this guy, but what I didn't tell you right at the beginning is sitting at the top of that water slide before we were allowed to help others down the slide. The older boys taught us how the whole thing worked. And I remember sitting there before the park opened, feeling the chill on my skin, having goosebumps, being super scared of what the older boys are going to think, being scared of screaming all the way down, being scared of, just looking bad. And And we are not sitting literally on top of water slides, but in some form or fashion, we are sitting on top of the water slides of our lives, of our jobs, of the challenges that the world brings on a daily basis. And if that is you, I want to encourage you to take the plunge with me. And if you are not as lucky to have somebody gently guide you down the slide, then I want to just remind you that sometimes you have to remind yourself that maybe you need to just give yourself a little push. Thank you.